Uh, oh, before I start talking about Hume, well, there's not that many people here, but maybe people will watch this recording if I manage to have a recording. Um, so I got a couple of questions about the ME uh, curve. And I can't say exactly what it will be because you know, I have to see what the total scores were like. But uh, 2 years ago, so there's 27 total points because there was nine of them, 27 total possible points. And 2 years ago, uh, someone got a C. The lowest C was 1 point. So they only got one correct answer the whole quarter, and that was C. There were a couple of people who failed because they got 0 points. And I believe they didn't actually do them all and get everything wrong. They just didn't do them. So, uh, and the highest score was 24. And I think, just looking at this, I was just looking at it on my other laptop. All right, you know what? I'm not going to try to find it now. If people are interested, I can send out an email, but it's, basically you can kind of fill in in the dots there. Um, all right. And was there anything else I wanted to talk about? Oh, well, uh, so the reminder, but I think Maggie has already been talking to people about this, about for the final essay, um, the, so the introductory paragraph and outline of the final paper are due um, this coming Tuesday, June 2nd. Um, and then I think the way Maggie worked out that she's going to do it is that people who want feedback on that will be able to meet with her like in individual Zoom sessions. Um, so yeah, I mean, you should definitely take advantage of that, but even if you don't take advantage of that, you should definitely hand it in because if you don't hand it in, it reduces your final paper grade. All right. Are there any questions about anything like that? Okay. So I'm going to start talking about skepticism. Um, right. So skepticism, I mean, um, skepticism is like, I guess, strictly speaking, is the view that we ought to suspend judgment or not believe. Um, right? The opposite of it in ancient philosophy, everyone who's not a skeptic, that's dogmatism, right? But dogmatism meaning not like a kind of irrationality, the way we often use dogmatism now, but dogmatism meaning you should believe something. um, so um, so Hume in the end uh, apparently describes his position as moderate skepticism, whatever that means exactly. I mean, I'll try to explain what that means. But in any case, like um, in part 4 of book 1, discusses, he makes very non-moderate skeptical arguments. Right. So, and then in the end, because he's a moderate skeptic, he's like not going to claim to believe the conclusions of those arguments, basically. But not because there's something wrong with the argument. So now let me get into more detail to try to explain what's going on. Um, so like Hume breaks it down into two parts. Now, in some years I've assigned both of these parts, but in this year I only assigned the second part. Partly because I gave Locke an extra lecture this year, and I'm not sure that worked out because I didn't end up ahead like on the rest of the Locke lectures. I ran out of time in exactly the same way I did in other weeks. So I don't know. Anyway, um, but right, so this year I didn't assign both of these, but the first one is skepticism with respect to reason. And the second one is skepticism with respect to the senses. So Hume, so wait, this is the one I didn't assign. And this obviously, well, I mean, both of these go way beyond the skeptical argument that Hume makes in the Enquiry. Because this is basically a division of the kinds of knowledge or probability that Locke thinks we have into two parts. And well, should I say it goes way beyond? I mean, a little bit confusing. Well, I'll just say what's included and then I'll try to figure out whether it goes way beyond or not. I mean, so like, because under here, so this part definitely goes way beyond. Under here, Hume includes skepticism about demonstrative arguments, about, whether you can believe or whether you can be certain about the conclusion of a demonstrative argument. That is, for example, the argument that 2 + 3 = 5, because, associative law, whatever. And you show that this equals 4 + 1, and that's the definition of 5. Right? That's a demonstrative argument. Although usually we do all of that at this one step, but in any case, so Hume raises the way this part works is that Hume demotes everything that seems to be demonstrative to the level of probability. And roughly speaking, by introducing the question, how sure are you that you did the demonstration correctly? And the answer is never 100%, according to Hume. So everything actually gets demoted to probability. That's the first part. And then he takes on, so like these are both of the things that Locke says reason is involved in, right? Remember, Locke says reason is involved both in knowledge and probability. So then he looks at the conclusions of probable arguments. And he demotes all of them to 0 probability. And roughly speaking, the way he does that is by asking, how sure are you that you got the probability right? And it's never 100%. And that starts a process where by step, the probability goes down until Hume says in a finite number of steps, it has to get to 0. That being another application of his usual principle that you can't go continuously to 0, right? There must be some smallest amount. And then from that, you have to go directly to 0. So what about these arguments? So like Hume says, well, and he, like at the beginning of this part, he reminds you of this, and he says it's going to be the same thing in this part, right? So what he says here is basically like, if the principles of reason always had equal influence, then this would indeed reduce the degree of our belief in anything to zero. So we would not consider ourselves to have evidence for anything. But he says, of course, nature hasn't left us free to do that. So we can no more help believing than we can help seeing the objects that are around us when our eyes are open. Right? Remember, belief is an impression. So we're passive with respect. So, and then he tries to explain exactly why, even though you might think that the laws of reason / the imagination would really reduce the probability to zero, they don't actually do that. So in the end, we have an argument that's valid in the sense that, again, if the principles of reason always had equal influence on our thoughts, then we would believe the conclusion of this argument. But fortunately, the principles of reason don't always have equal influence in our thought. And so even though the argument is like rationally compelling, it doesn't compel us. So he starts this section by saying the same. So those are the two types of things he discusses in that first section. In the second section, he's basically talking about what Locke calls sensible knowledge. And again, like, I don't know what to say about the probability part, but again, the sensible knowledge, again, goes beyond what he made skeptical arguments about in the inquiry, right? Because remember, in the inquiry, he gave us the immediate objects of our senses and memory. And he was only asking about the basis of our belief in remote matters of fact, as I put it, right? Matters of fact beyond senses and memory. But here he's taking on the immediate objects of our senses and raising skeptical doubts about it. And he says, to begin with, this is going to be the same thing as in case number one, namely that, of course, like, no matter what I argue here, an hour hence, you will again believe in bodies and whatever, the same way you ever did. But in the end, it turns out that it's not so clear, or it's maybe not exactly the same as the first case. So like towards the end of part 4, section 2 on page 266, the bottom. And this is the first, well, I don't know, there might be other times, but this is the first time I'm aware of where he does this, he does this tricky move in this book, and he'll do it again at the end of book 1. Having thus given, so this is near the bottom of page 266. Having thus given an account of all the systems, both popular and philosophical, with regard to external existences, I cannot forbear giving vent to a certain sentiment which arises upon reviewing those systems. I begun this subject with premising that we ought to have an implicit faith in our senses, and that this would be the conclusion I should draw from the whole of my reasoning. But to be ingenuous, that's such a strange thing to say. To be ingenuous, that is like, I mean, it means basically the same thing as to be honest, right? To be honest, to be ingenuous, I feel myself at present of a quite contrary sentiment, and at present is italicized, of a quite contrary sentiment, and am more inclined to repose no faith at all in my senses, or rather imagination, than to place it in such an implicit confidence. I cannot conceive how such trivial qualities of the fancy, conducted by such false suppositions, can ever lead to any solid and rational system. Right? So, like, he starts off the section by saying, it doesn't matter what I say. We're definitely going to believe in our senses, and we're going to believe that there are bodies. And therefore, like, I'm not going to try to prove there are no bodies. I'm just going to try to explain why we think there are, right? Like, what are the causes of it? It's similar to something he says in the Enquiry, where he says, yeah, we definitely do believe that the future will be like the past. But, perhaps it's permissible for a philosopher to ask why. What makes us believe that? Right? So that's what he says at the beginning. But then at the end, he says, but now having just gone through all these arguments, I'm like, who could believe that? Because unlike in this case, um, this case like doesn't find a mistake in our demonstrative or probable reasoning. It just adds a correction, and the correction turns out to be so big that they all go to zero, right? But in this one, like once he gets into the details of why we believe there are bodies outside of us, um, it turns out, as he says here, to be for all kinds of like manifestly erroneous reasons. um, and so he says, no, I feel like now this is what I meant by when I said it's a tricky move here, right? Of course, obviously, it's not like, did I say this before about Hume in this class? Probably. I always said, but that there's something, especially in the treatise, there's something that's going on that's kind of like Descartes in the Meditations, right? There's like a fictional character, and it's as if you're listening in on what they're thinking. But of course, that's not really what's happening, right? Like, it's not like, I mean, Hume wrote this and revised it and sent it to a publisher and whatever, right? So it's not like he suddenly thought, no, what am I saying? I shouldn't have said that. I mean, if he really meant that, he could have gone back and erased it and written it differently, right? So it's a fiction. Um, and as I said, the same fiction comes back more strongly at the end of book one. So I think I'll talk about it more then. Although in the past, I sometimes ran out of time to talk about it. But oh well, the future won't be like the if the future is like the past, I'll keep making that joke over and over. All right. Um, okay, so that's just like a kind of confusing introduction to what Hume is going to claim to accomplish here. Namely, it's not clear what he's going to claim to accomplish. But all right, so now to the beginning of the argument. Or well, actually, I guess before the beginning of the argument. So first of all, so skepticism with regard to the senses means he breaks it down into two parts. I hope it's not too confusing when I use one and two again. But anyway, he breaks it down into two parts. The continued and distinct existence of things outside of us, or of, let's say, I mean, I'll say this. I'm trying to keep ambiguous to begin with between what he calls the vulgar view and the philosophical view, right? Vulgar, by the way, so vulgar just means common, right? So when he said, like, sometimes you see in this period, you'll see the expression vulgar sense instead of common sense. It doesn't necessarily mean something bad. And unless, at least only insofar as common is something bad, right? Like, oh, that's so common, right? But you can probably guess that Hume isn't really on that side, that common is something bad. It's going to turn out that the vulgar view is probably better than the philosophical view. So, but in any case, so like to keep it neutral, for now, I'll say like the continued and distinct existence of the objects of the senses. So continued means that they still exist even when I'm not sensing them, right? So like when I close my eyes, um, what I was seeing is still there. And distinct existence, I mean, he breaks it down into two parts. He says, it's external to us, like literally external in space, I guess. And also that it's independent. I mean, it's unclear to me what this part adds or why he brings it in. Maybe because of some of the objections he wants to address, put a lot of emphasis on this. They, right, they say like, well, when I look out the window, I see things that are way far away. How could those be like not distinct from me? I'm here, and right. So, but anyway, like this is the main one, like independent of us in their existence. He says that, right, like these are the two parts of the view that um, um, these are the two things that we're supposed to be able to conclude from our senses, and the skeptical argument is going to be about whether we can or not. That is, we're supposed to be able to conclude that there's something that I'm seeing or feeling or whatever that continues to exist even when I'm not seeing or feeling it. And I'm supposed to be able to conclude that there's something that I'm seeing or feeling that doesn't depend on me for its existence. Unlike an idea, right, or impression, which does depend on me for its existence. Maybe I shouldn't say that yet. I mean, kind of. All right. I think I'm gonna have to immediately like introduce the vulgar view and the philosophical view, because otherwise, I mean, both the vulgar and the philosophers say that they believe the evidence of their senses, that the things that they see and feel and whatever exist, but they mean something really different by it. And these two things end up meaning something really different. So the view of the vulgar is that the objects of the senses are the very beings that the mind perceives. In other words, although the vulgar wouldn't call it this, the vulgar believe that the objects of the senses are impressions. Right? So the vulgar um, right? So like here's the mind, and here's the impressions. And the view of the vulgar is, first of all, that like the very thing I see is, for example, the table. The thing that's immediately perceived by my mind is the table. Now, the thing that's immediately perceived by my mind is an impression. Therefore, the vulgar believe that the table is an impression. So far, the vulgar agree with Berkeley. Right? Berkeley says, I mean, Berkeley doesn't use the term impression, but remember, Hume is dividing what Berkeley and Locke call ideas into two parts, and he's calling basically the ones that belong to sense, impression, and the other ones that belong to the imagination, ideas. Right? So this impression is what Berkeley would call an idea of sense. One of those ideas that's regular and strong and right, etc. So far the vulgar agree with Berkeley. Berkeley says, what is the table? The table is some of my impressions. That is some of my ideas in Berkeley's language. So, um, so because what Hume is attributing to the vulgar agrees with Berkeley in that respect, Hume is agreeing with Berkeley in that respect about what common sense is, right? Like Berkeley says, yeah, it's some weird thing that philosophers believe that the table is something other than my impression. Common sense is that the table just is my impression. But of course, what Berkeley doesn't agree with is that the vulgar believe these two things, right? Berkeley thinks those two things are absurd, and no one really believes them. But Hume says, no, Berkeley, you're right. The vulgar don't distinguish between the table and their table impression. But they do think that the table has a continued and distinct existence. So what that means is the vulgar think that my impressions exist even when I'm not perceiving them. And that they don't depend on me for their being. So like, how can you draw this? Well, I mean, a first indication of the trouble the vulgar are going to get into is that you can't really draw it here, right? Because like Hume thinks of an impression, as Berkeley does, as something mental, but the vulgar believe that it's not part of their mind. It doesn't depend on them. So, um, um, but we'll see actually that when Hume discusses the details of the vulgar's view, he's going to argue that it's not absurd, that it's not a contradiction in terms, as Berkeley would think it is, for an impression to exist outside of a mind, or for an impression to sometimes exist inside a mind, and at other times still exist, but not inside that mind. So that's basically what the vulgar believe. The vulgar believe that the table is an impression, and when I'm seeing the table, I'm seeing it directly. There's no double object here, right? I'm not seeing a representation of it. I'm seeing the table directly. And so, like, it's something that's present to my mind, which is what Berkeley would say is like the existence of an idea is to be perceived, right? Present to my mind, in my mind, perceived existence. Those are all the same thing according to Berkeley. But the vulgar don't think that. The vulgar think that, sure, it's present to my mind when I see it, but when I close my eyes or turn away, that same thing is still there. The same thing that was immediately present to my mind is still there, but now it's not present to my mind. And therefore it must be distinct, right? So Hume says these two things actually, these are not really supposed to be two parts of the view that you could believe one and not the other, right? Hume says that they mutually imply each other. If it continues even when it's not present to my mind, then it must be independent of my mind. And on the other hand, if it's independent of my mind, then at least there's no reason to think that it wouldn't continue when it's not present to my mind, right? That's irrelevant if it's independent of my mind. So, so these two things imply each other, never, according to Hume at least. I mean, I think you could raise some questions about that, but let's assume that's right. They imply each other. So, so why is Hume distinguishing them from each other? Well, basically because when he gets into the details, he's going to ask which of these things like first attracts our imagination. And whichever one it is, then the other one is going to follow along because they imply each other. All right, so so on the other hand, the view of the philosophers is that my impression is different from the sensible object, from the body, right? So this, the impression is here and the actual table is out here. So this is Locke's view, right? This is the double object view. But it's not just Locke, although I think Hume focuses on Locke, but Descartes believes some version of this. The truth is, Berkeley also, in a sense, believes some version of this. Because Berkeley does think there's something that's independent of my mind that caused that impression or idea, right? Namely, a spirit. But these philosophers don't include Berkeley because these philosophers think that, at least in some respects, this impression resembles this. So when they say they believe in continued and distinct existence, they mean, right? So like this is a picture of me like looking at the table, closing my eyes and then opening them again, right? Like this is the impression when my eyes were open. This is the lack of that impression while my eyes were closed. And this is the impression after I opened my eyes. And what the vulgar believe is the same impression. I just wasn't seeing it while my eyes were closed. It continues, it had a continued existence. Whereas the philosophers say, no, there was this impression, there was this table impression, then there were no table impressions, and then there was a new table impression, right? So the impression is not continued, and it's also not distinct, depends on my mind, right? It's like an accident of my mind. But there is something that resembles it and that caused it, and that thing is continued and distinct, right? So the table that's out there is not one of my impressions, and when I close my eyes, there's no table impression anymore, but there's still a table. And when I open them, it's still the same table, right? So the table continues, but the impression is new. So, like, since these views are different, skepticism is going to be different in these two cases, right? Here, skepticism means doubting that the impression continues even when I'm not perceiving it. Here, skepticism means, given that the impression doesn't continue when I'm not seeing it, I'm doubting that there's something else that does continue, namely the external objects. And again, I think I mentioned this last time. Hume has already ruled out as absurd the possibility that there's something out here that continues and is distinct and causes both of these impressions, but it doesn't resemble them. Right? So in other words, there's an external object that's the cause of my impressions, but it's a completely different kind of thing for my impressions. I don't know what it's like. And again, or at least I don't know what it's like by having ideas or impressions of it, right? Because none of my ideas and impressions don't resemble it. And again, that's basically Berkeley's view, right? So Hume has already ruled out Berkeley's view, strictly speaking, as absurd. Right? This is on page 239, book 1, part 4, section 2. For as to the notion of external existence, when taken for something specifically different from our perceptions, we have already shown its absurdity. He spells shown with an E. This is not important, but it's just the boldest thing I'm teaching you. This is just a spelling difference. It's not pronounced shoon, it's pronounced shown. It's like so. So anyway, all right. For some reason, Anscombe, is it Anscombe? Yeah, I think Anscombe, when she translated the philosophical investigations, used the E form of shown, like the way Hume does. All right. Okay, sorry. So, right. So, and it's because Hume, uh, maybe I shouldn't, why is it, why is that exactly? But that seems to make sense to Berkeley, but seems absurd to Hume. I mean, remember when Berkeley says that um, he admits that not all of his words stand for ideas in that case. So, right, like when he says there is something that it doesn't resemble any idea, obviously that doesn't mean I have an idea of something that doesn't resemble any idea. Um, so rather, that word something there stands for a spirit. And remember, I said like stands for a spirit means it expresses the will of a spirit or something like that. Uh-huh. So, assuming Hume understands Berkeley the same way I do, he has to be um, objecting to that use of language. Yeah. Anyway, I don't want to say more about that. Also, it's possible that Hume doesn't understand Berkeley the same way I do, and he thinks Berkeley is just speaking nonsense. Right? That's so, yeah. So, um, I'm not aware of anywhere that Hume explicitly discusses this with respect to Berkeley. Well, that doesn't mean there isn't somewhere, but I'm not aware of somewhere. Anyway, um, okay, so in this section, right, so Berkeley's view is not here, but we have the vulgar view and we have basically Locke's view, which is similar to Descartes and a bunch of other people in this respect. So, so Hume in this section spends most of the time explaining how the vulgar view originates. Um, and explaining that it's a conclusion we reach through a natural and unavoidable, although not rational process. Right? So and therefore he says, even philosophers most of the time hold the vulgar view, right? Like when they're not thinking really hard about this, they're just going about their life. Hume says philosophers also hold the vulgar view, right? So like when Locke, goes down to the kitchen to get a glass of water or whatever, uh, he doesn't believe that he doesn't really believe that the glass of water is one thing and what he's seeing is something else. And that it's this double object or whatever. It's just like he can only maintain that when he's concentrating really hard on this. Um, so because it's an overwhelmingly natural and unavoidable process that leads to this belief of the vulgar. Um, Now, on the other hand, like I said, it's not rational. It's not a rational process. And it's not even rational. I already erased this, but it's not rational in either of the senses, like according to either of the things that Locke thinks reason does, right? Like it's certainly not a demonstration that this view is correct. But not only that, it's not a valid conclusion from effects to causes or something like that, right? That is, it's not a regular argument of probability. It's another principle of the imagination that comes in here. Um, okay, so I mean, so far you might think, well, so what? We have this principle of the imagination, we have this principle of the imagination, right? Because remember, Hume's claim is that at least when it comes to probable reasoning, like all the things that Locke attributes to reason are really due to the imagination. Conclusions from effect to cause, right, are due to principles of association. When we have one idea, it calls up another one that I used to have. So it's not the order of reason, it's the order of association of ideas. So um, uh, So why does it make so much difference if it's a different principle of the imagination here? Um, but I think it makes a difference because Hume goes on to explain that reason, and again, this isn't demonstrative reason, but it's regular reasoning about causes and effects. Reason shows that this view is certainly false. It's not absurd. So, right, Berkeley says this is absurd. An impression couldn't exist outside my mind. Hume is going to argue that it's not absurd, so it is something we can believe, but unfortunately, when we believe it, we're believing something false, at least according to reason, right? So, right, so this is on page, okay, I'm going to read from later on in book, in part four, section 7 on page 313. Um, But though these two operations, so the two operations are reason from cause and effects, and the principle that causes us to believe in the continued and distinct existence of our impressions. But though these two operations be equally natural and necessary in the human mind, yet in some circumstances they are directly contrary, nor is it possible for us to reason justly and regularly from causes and effects and at the same time believe the continued existence of matter. Um, right? So it does make a difference that it's a different principle because the one principle that we use all around along that we use all the time as the basis for all our reasoning about matters of fact, namely the reasoning from effects to causes, actually contradicts what this other principle of the imagination is doing. So we can't keep thinking the way we usually do and obey this irresistible impulse to believe that our impressions continue, even when we're not seeing them or perceiving them. So, like that, all of that is what he does in section 2 of book 1, part 4, section 2. Then the following two sections, section 3 and section 4, he, or well, sorry, so though I should say, so that's most of section 2 is trying to establish that. Then the end of section 2 is explaining how the philosophical view arises as a response to that situation, right? So we find ourselves in this situation where two principles of our imagination are clashing with each other. We feel like we want to believe both of these two things, but the two things contradict each other. And so the way the vulgar usually deal with it, and that is the way all of us usually deal with it most of the time, is just to ignore it. Right? Like if you don't think too hard about it, you won't get into this problem. And that's kind of like Hume's overall moral of his philosophy. I just think that's what moderate skepticism means. Like, don't think too hard about it. Stop when it gets annoying. But so that's the way the vulgar deal with this contradiction. But philosophers, of course, are not willing to deal with it that way. Um, so what do? Well, they invent this picture that sort of satisfies both principles, right? Where they can on the one hand, they can say, so like when Hume talks about this, he often makes it like a kind of duel between reason and imagination. But again, really, it's just imagination on both sides, right? It's just a different principle of the imagination. But anyway, so like he could say to the principle that wants to believe in continued distinct existence, here it is, you have continued distinct existence. And then on the other hand, um, they can say to the regular principle of effects and causes that says, what do you mean continued existence? This impression is something completely different from this one. Say, yeah, you're right. The impressions are completely different. um, so, um, and Hume says this is especially convenient because it's kind of easy to get it mixed up with this one. So when you stop doing your philosophy thinking and go back into ordinary life, you can kind of comfortably slide back from this one to this one. Right? Like you don't have to make a jarring transition. You just kind of stop thinking about the distinction between the table and the table impression. Um, And so like Hume's claim is going to be that the philosopher's response is in a sense a natural response, but it's not in any way a rational response. Um, and the view that results. Now remember, like Hume himself, when he's not in this section, like we saw this when he's talking about space and time, Hume himself adopts this philosophical view, right? So when he says, like, philosophers can't help accepting this view, but the truth is there's no good reason for it. Um, he's including himself in the philosophers who can't help accepting the view when they're not thinking about the skeptical argument. Um, but yeah, I mean, so the conclusion is going to be that, um, the only reason there was behind this view, as Hume says, it has no primary recommendation to reason or the imagination. That is, if you didn't first have this view, you would never think of this one. It's only as a response to this one running into trouble that you introduce this hypothesis of an external object. And so there's no evidence to support it, basically. Right? Like the evidence to support it is you believed something false. um, and you want to keep believing that false thing. That's not evidence, right? So yeah, so that's the end of section 2, and then in section 3 and section 4. So again, in some years I assigned both section 3 and section 4. This year I only assigned section 4, but in section 3 and section 4, he takes on two specific versions of the philosophical view, right? The first one is what he calls the ancient philosophy, and it's basically Aristotelianism. And the second one is what he calls the modern philosophy, and that's basically Locke. Um, and what he says in that section 3 about the ancient philosophy is that um, it's extravagant and silly, and I think he also thinks it's incoherent. But in any case, it's not something the vulgar would ever believe, and it's not something that uncorrupted philosophers would ever believe. Um, it's it's basically a wild. Well, at the beginning of section 4, he compares it to like believing, being afraid of unknown specters in the dark. Right. So he says you could say that that's a form of reasoning, that it's natural path for our mind to take, but only in the same sense that you could say that like getting sick is natural to our body. It's natural to your body, sure, but it's not good for you. Right. So, but then he goes to the modern view, and the modern view is supposed to do away with all these extravagant opinions about occult faculties and occult qualities and substantial forms and whatever, and just get some good, solid, hard reasoning about bodies and how they bump into each other. And by the time Hume gets into it, he concludes that the modern philosophy view is not so much false or even incoherent as unintelligible. That is, there's no way to understand like what they claim to be saying. So hopefully I'll get to the details of all of that, but that's kind of a summary of everything, all the reading for today. So are there questions before I go on? Okay. So I already said this about continued and distinct existence. Right. So to explain how this view arises, and again, to begin with, we're talking about the vulgar version. So to explain how this view arises, we have to explain how the imagination can transfer force or vivacity from a present or remembered impression to the idea of something we never, by definition, perceive. Right? Because we're supposed to move from believing in the existence of the impressions we actually perceive to the existence of impressions we don't perceive. So, I mean, of course, that's going to happen by way of an idea, right? Like we're going to have an idea of something continuing the whole time. But like this part of the idea, so to speak, I guess it's a complex idea. Actually, how does Hume think about this? Good question. But in any case, this idea, or the idea in this respect that it contains this continuation, is by definition the idea of something unperceived. Um, and it's, I guess, what am I trying to say here? I mean, of course, every time you believe in a remote matter of fact, you're believing in something that's not perceived, right? But it's a belief in a type of things that are never perceived, namely impressions that aren't in my mind. Right. So unlike the belief in remote matters of fact, which those are always beliefs in things like um, that, so to speak, I could have perceived, that someone perceived, that I remember having perceived something like that in the past, and and so on and so forth. But here there's like a type of thing that's defined as unperceivable, and somehow I have an idea of that, and I have to transfer vivacity to it. Um, so how does this happen? Um, so there's two parts to the explanation. Um, First of all, the extensions that we call external. Now, it's like the impressions that we, what did I say? The sensations that we call external, or the impressions that we call external, I guess I should say. The impressions that, because it's the impressions that we call sensations, basically. So, right, because some of our impressions, like pain and pleasure, we don't form this view about. Locke also and Berkeley also put a lot of weight on this, right? That although I may believe that there's like whiteness in the table that resembles my idea of whiteness, and that even when I'm not looking at the table, the whiteness is still there. If like um, I hurt my finger on a pin, I don't think that there's pain in the pin that resembles the pain in my finger, and that even when it's not pricking me, the pain is still there. At least that's the claim. I mean, it sounds right, but I don't know. Maybe you could probably argue against it. But um, so, and Hume says similarly, like when it comes to the passions, we don't believe that they continue to exist when they're not present to our mind. Now, I mean, this may not be so true anymore. Right? Like a lot of us at least believe that we have like unconscious anger, right? That it's not present to our mind, but it's there. Um, but I think actually that that type of belief is not a problem for Hume because I think it goes along with starting to think the same kind of things about anger that he says we think about sensations. So, I mean, so like this is what he says we think about sensations. Um, that as opposed to passions, they have a certain kind of regularity, but it's a defective kind of regularity. So, because the passions, of course, also have a certain kind of regularity, right? So, like, I don't know what, hate follows from anger or something like that. Like, here's an impression of hate, and here's anger. There's a regularity. I don't know if this is a real regularity, but it's things like this, right? So, so are they less regular than now? So remember, we're talking about impressions here, right? So like none of this is against Berkeley's claim that my impressions are more regular than my mere ideas, right? That is my what Berkeley would call, maybe this is why Hume adopted this terminology because he didn't want to keep trying to explain this. With Berkeley, those especially strong and regular and whatever ideas that are what Hume calls impressions. Berkeley says they're more regular than my other fainter ideas. So I mean, all the things Hume is talking about are impressions here, though. So he's not comparing them to my other fainter ideas. They're all impressions. The question is, how regular are the impressions? And so the answer is, well, they're all kind of regular, which again is exactly what Berkeley would say, right? They're all kind of regular, but the regularity is different. In the case of these, um, the regularity um, is, as far as it goes, um, perfect. That is, um, there don't seem to be any missing steps. Whereas right, so here, these are now like, you know, a visual impression and a, get rid of that for now. And like an auditory impression. So here there's a regularity, but many times the regularity is defective, and we can make it better by adding in missing pieces. Right? Or as Hume explains, this is on page 246. Right? So first he says, our passions are found by experience to have a mutual connection with and dependence on each other, but on no occasion is it necessary to suppose that they have existed and operated when they were not perceived in order to preserve the same dependence and connection of which we have had experience. Whereas in the case of impressions of the senses, those require a continued existence or otherwise lose in a great measure the regularity of their operation. So, like, for example, by experience, I've formed a certain rule. Every time a door opens, I hear, and only then I hear a certain sound, right? So now, I mean, once again, we saw this in Berkeley too, and other places in Hume. Like Hume is saying, when Hume says the door opens, he means the visible door, right? He's talking about the visible impression of the door, but he's talking about as if that's the door and the sound is another impression, right? I mean, why give vision that precedence is not clear. So, but anyway, so I'm not going to talk about it. I have the visual door opening impression, and there's a constant conjunction between that and this other um, audible door opening impression. So, so that's a nice regularity, but Hume says, but here I am sitting at my desk facing away from the door, and I hear that sound, but I don't see the visible door opening. So that would be an exception to the rule. If I don't say, oh no, there was a visible door too. But if I do, then the regularity becomes perfect. So, and I think, like to the extent that we believe in things like unconscious anger, it's because we start to believe the same thing about the passions, right? That there's certain regularities that that uh, can be made more perfect by assuming that sometimes there's anger there, even though I don't perceive it, right? Like it has the effects of anger, but I don't perceive anger. And I say, well, it's because there was anger there, but it was unconscious. So like I said, I don't think that view would be a problem for you if you were familiar with it. Now, like at first you might think that this is just a regular application of the association of ideas, the way it figures in reasoning about cause and effect. Um, it's just the usual effect of custom, that is constant conjunction on the imagination. Um, and Hume does describe it that way. This is, I shouldn't have closed it. It's also on page 246. Um, I never have observed that this noise could proceed from anything but I guess I should say from anything. Anyway, I never have observed that this noise could proceed from anything but the motion of a door. Right? So, I mean, if that were right, then this would just be an instance of the usual probable reasoning about cause and effect. But that's not exactly what's going on here because I'm not predicting that I'm going to see the door open. Um, um, Again, I'm talking specifically about a visible door opening that is not perceivable. Right. So it's not like my imagination is by association producing like what I expect to happen next. Um, my imagination is producing a belief in something that I don't expect to perceive. Right? Like by the time I turn around, the door is finished opening. So I can't see a visible door opening anymore. And so when you think of it that way, you realize that actually, like the statement of the way I form the association is wrong. It's not true that I never have perceived that this noise could proceed from anything but a door opening. Every time I wasn't looking at that is a visible door opening, every time I wasn't looking at the door when it opened, I perceived the audible door opening without the visible door opening. So this regularity actually has lots of exceptions. And it has exactly as many exceptions as cases where we're trying to use it to establish the rule, right? So Hume says that regular reasoning about cause and effect can't get us this. That is, we can't acquire a habit of, of having this visible door opening idea with belief every time from the experience of only having let's say 70% of the time I was looking at the door and 30% of the time I wasn't. So the regularity is that these two go together 70% of the time. But the custom I'm trying to establish is of believing they go together 100% of the time. And Hume says, but the 70% of the time can never justify the 100% of the time conclusion, right? What I should believe is that these often go together, but sometimes not. And how many times not? All the times when I've heard the door without seeing it, right? So the whole reason for believing in the visible door that I don't see would go away. Like it exactly cancels out, so to speak. This is what Hume is talking about on page 248. Um, um, "'Tis not only impossible that any habit should ever be acquired otherwise than by the regular succession of these perceptions, but also that any habit should ever exceed that degree of regularity." Right? So the degree of regularity in this, I was imagining is 70%. So the habit can only be 70% strong, so to speak. Um, in other words, this is like a huge overgeneralization. we believe that door closing sound always goes with door closing visual appearance, um, even though it just manifestly doesn't. It often goes with it, but often it doesn't, right? So, um, or I guess maybe that's not exactly the right way to put it. We manifestly don't perceive that they always go together. We only perceive them together 70% of the time. So, like, we're not contradicting ourselves. This is getting to why the vulgarist view is not absurd. We're not contradicting ourselves, but we are like somehow using the 70% of the time when we see this to justify the belief that it's there the other 30% of the times when we don't see it. And that's just going beyond the evidence. Um, so Hume says, this is part of what goes into the belief, and it tends towards the belief of the I think he says it tends to the belief of the continued existence, although looking at it, I'm not sure why it's more continuous than distinct. So anyway, so one of the things that goes into this is that we do have a tendency to overgeneralize this way. Hume says that the imagination overshoots the actual regularity. It's like by a kind of inertia. And he says it's the same thing, it's the same principle he was talking about when he talked about spatial measurement, where he said, because we experience like a finite process of increasing the accuracy of our measurements by correction, our imagination like goes on to believe that there's an infinite process, by which we could have an absolutely perfect measurement. So he says it's something similar here. I mean, first of all, that's a weird way to think about inertia. I mean, it's like basically the same mistake that I pointed out in Berkeley, thinking that inertia means that there's like a special thing that keeps pushing the body after the imposed force is taken away, as opposed to bodies remain in motion until acted on by an outside force. But that's not really, I don't know if that's directly relevant, except I'd say that like whenever you see a philosopher using a metaphor, you always have to ask yourself, okay, what about the literal basis for the metaphor? Is it right? There's this thing is it in Austin? So one of the ordinary language, no, it's not Austin, I don't remember, but about the pants word. Like, no, I think it is Austin. He says, like, in pairs of contrary words, one of them wears the pants. And you have to figure out which one it is. So I'm like, hold on a second, that metaphor is kind of sketchy. Because a metaphor is just like in pairs of human beings, right? Like one of them wears the pants, and that's usually the one who's in charge, and the other one wears a skirt. They're similar to that. Words are right. Like, or also the thing about I don't remember who is it, Dawkins or one of those guys about sky hooks versus cranes, that you should explain things. If something's off the ground, you should explain it as being lifted by a crane, not being lifted by a sky hook. And this is supposed to be like why scientific explanation is better than supernatural or whatever. But, you know, Galileo discovered that the earth is in the sky. And cranes are sky hooks. All right. Anyway, sorry, that was really a big rush, but all right. But sorry, right. So moving back to Hume. So that's one of the factors, but Hume concludes, I'm afraid this is not strong enough to explain the strength of our belief in continued and distinct existence of our impressions. So this is one factor, but it's not enough by itself. So the second factor is the way we tend to confuse um, relation, and especially the relation of resemblance with identity. And I see I'm not going fast enough. Let me erase the philosophers. Actually, I think it's all yeah, I need a big space to draw this. Right. So first of all, what is identity? And I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, even though it's really interesting. Wait, let me not draw this. So what is identity? So like Hume points out the same problem about the supposed relation of identity that's causing trouble for Locke, right? That is, it's supposed to be a relation of something to itself, but a relation has to have two terms. Um, Now, I mean, you can ask yourself, like, oh, why doesn't that bother us anymore after Frege or whatever? I don't know. I don't want to try to explain, but it like, but a relation is a relation of something to something, and if they're the same, there's no relation. That's what Locke and Hume are both worried about here, and they both invoke like time to explain what's going on here, but almost the opposite ways. So, like, Locke basically says there's two things that are really different, right? Like this little oak sapling and this big, at this time, and this big, I guess they're in the same place. Well, I don't know. Anyway, so there's this little oak sapling at this time, and there's this big oak tree at another time. Clearly, they're not the same. One of them is much bigger than the other, right? So, but we treat them as the same for certain purposes. That's basically Locke's answer. So at least in most cases, if not always, according to Locke, identity is the sameness in some respect of things that are really different. Whereas Hume says that, and you can't actually draw Hume's view on these axes because Hume says that as long as something doesn't change, we have no idea of time, of like temporal parts in that thing. Right? So if there's something that's not changing at all, because he says we get our idea. Remember, I mentioned this last time. The parts of time have to be different from each other, according to Hume. It's not enough for them to be colored or solid. They also have to change, or else we don't get the idea of time. So if something's not changing, then there's only one time there. But meanwhile, something else over here is changing. So what does that mean? Well, it means that both this and this are simultaneous with this, even though they're not simultaneous with each other, because there's only one time here. So this time is simultaneous with this time, but also with this one, even though these are different, right? So that's why you couldn't draw it in a chart like this. Hume doesn't think that you can foliate space-time into surfaces where everything's at the same time. Nor does he think that you can sort of do that the way you can in special relativity. He thinks that that's totally wrong. You can have one thing that's simultaneous with many others. But because these things change while this thing stays the same, we have a tendency to imagine that this thing does have temporal parts. So by a fiction, we think of this unchanging thing as sort of double, being at this time and at this time. And the relation of identity is a fictional relation between these fictionally different things that are really the same. um, so like going back to a case like this though, what will Hume say about this? Well, because here there isn't something that didn't change, right? It changed. So Hume says the relation here is really resemblance, not identity, right? Identity is a fictional relation between the fictional temporal parts of something that doesn't really have temporal parts. This is a perfectly good non-fictional relation between two things that are completely different. But he says we tend to confuse this with this. Right? So what for Locke is like the kind of paradigmatic example of identity, for Hume is confusing resemblance with identity. So we do that in the case of the oak tree, and he said that's what leads us to believe this Aristotelian nonsense that the oak tree has a substantial form that remains the same while it grows and whatever, right? And we also do that with our impressions. So like if I saw the table and then I close my eyes and then I open my eyes again, um, so these things resemble each other very closely. The old table impression and the new table impression. Is that a fire alarm or what is that? No? Oh. If it was this building, like right up on the roof. Oh, right. We have, yeah. So okay, I don't know what it is. So these two impressions resemble each other very closely. I do think it's a fire alarm. I don't see anyone leaving the building now. Stopped. All right. My daughter just got her high school yearbook and they kept a list of the dates of all the fire alarms. Anyway, so they don't appear to be the same. Now, I mean, actually, Hume talks as if they're evidently not the same, is what he keeps saying. But it's going to turn out because, again, Hume thinks that what the vulgar conclude, namely that this really is the same thing that exists the whole time, is not absurd, right? So it's not true that we literally perceive that they're different things, but we didn't, in our perception, there was no indication that they were the same thing because there was this period in between, right, when they weren't there, and then when this wasn't there, and then there was something else that resembled it. So, so we have no reason to think that this is the same as this, but we do perceive that this resembles this. Well, that is, we remember, right? Later on, we remember that this resembled this. And we get that memory confused with a possible memory of seeing this the whole time. And seeing this the whole time, again, would mean, so you can't really draw the mind on this one-dimensional line either, because the same problem about simultaneity, right? But because seeing it the whole time, not changing, would mean there's really just one time. Right? Like if that were the only idea in my mind, I wouldn't experience any time passing. If I could focus on the table so much that everything else was excluded from my mind, no time would pass for me while I was doing that. And like afterwards, when I kind of woke up, I would find that other things were different than they were before, but I wouldn't have experienced any temporal distance. So, right, so that, Hume says these two experiences are very similar to each other. In fact, they resemble each other. And so he also says, I'm sorry this argument is so hard to follow, but the reason it's hard to follow is actually an example of the principle I'm using. He says, it's hard to follow because there's two relations of resemblance being used in this argument, and it's easy to confuse them with each other because they resemble each other, because they're both relations of resemblance, right? But we have to try to keep them separate. The point is that uh, the memory of this experience is a memory of the mind, or is this in the original or in the memory? I think it's in the memory, although Hume isn't really careful about this. In the memory, I slide very easily from remembering seeing table before I close my eyes to seeing table after I close my eyes, after I open them again. I slide very easily from them because the relation of resemblance gives me a tendency to go from one to the other. So I barely notice that I'm going from one thing to another when I remember this. So it's very similar. That is, it resembles what I would remember if I saw something, just one thing. And therefore, I tend to confuse them. That is, I start thinking that these two things were the same. Right? It's the same thing that happens with the oak tree. I start thinking that this big thing and this little thing were the same because this one gradually grew into this one and it resembled itself at every step and so forth, right? So similarly here, I start to think that these two things were the same. Um, so I start to believe that there was a single impression, not two different ones. But there was an interruption between this and this. How could that be if they're the same thing? Well, only one way, namely, and I guess, now you should really draw it like, because this thing, no time passed for this thing, right? Like, assuming the table looks exactly the same when I open my eyes again. If it's not exactly the same, then the story is going to be a little more complicated, but the same basic idea, right? So, no time actually passed for this thing. So maybe shouldn't really draw it like this, but I'm going to draw it like that because otherwise it's really hard to draw. All right, so, right, so I say, well, how could these two be the same thing if there was this interruption between them? Answer, that was an interruption in my perceiving of it, not an interruption in the impression itself. And that's the vulgar view. So Hume says between those two, and boy, I have like what, 3 minutes left to talk, 2 minutes left to talk about the philosophical view. I think I already said what's important about it, but so, and again, Hume says, Berkeley would say, well, that's nonsense. It's an impression. It has to be perceived. Its being is to be perceived. But Hume says that is, well, no, let me not try to, let me just say what Hume says about this. Hume says, okay, impressions and ideas are a certain kind of thing. Yeah, maybe I should say. So, right, so Berkeley says it's nonsense because to be is to be perceived. That is, to inhere in a substance that is a mind, right? These things can't exist by themselves. They need support of a substance that is a mind. That's the traditional view. Now, again, for Berkeley, the words like substance and inhere signify in some weird way, but it still comes out the same as ever. But Hume says, I don't have any idea of this continuing substance that all my ideas and impressions inhere in. all I perceive is a kind of heap of ideas and impressions that are related to each other in certain ways. And basically, an impression being present to the mind at a certain time is one of those relations that makes it part of that heap that I call myself. It says it's just a relation. There's no absurdity in considering the thing to change its relations. Right? So what happened was, now it's really hard to draw, but you know, what happened was that here's two different times in my mind. Or let's say three different times, because there has to be one in between. So, and here's this idea. Now, this idea isn't changing, so it doesn't have three different times. It's just one time here, right? But it did change its relations. So at time one, this unchanging thing stood in the relation of being present to this heap of ideas. The heap of ideas changes, and it changes again. And at this time, again, this thing stands in this relation to this new heap of ideas. But in between, there was a heap of ideas that this thing didn't stand in that relation to. And then there's obviously other relations between these heaps that make them all me. So Hume says, this is not absurd. There's no contradiction in this. So the vulgar can, so to speak, be free to use this. I mean, it's not rational. It started with a mistake, right? It started with confusing two things that are not the same. They resemble each other, but they're not the same. And then that led to trying to hold contradictory beliefs at the same time, which is uncomfortable, Hume says. So, oh, but we can relieve ourselves by inventing this fiction. So Hume says it's not rational, but there's nothing to prevent you from doing it. It's not absurd. Now I'm already over time. So I'll just say, but he thinks it's certainly false. Why is it certainly false? Well, like press one of your eyeballs with your finger. All of a sudden, there was one pen. Now that is one pen impression. Now there are two. They don't both have a continued distinct existence. It's not the continued part that's the problem, but the distinct part, right? Because since the doubling resulted from something I did to myself, both of those pen impressions can't be independent of me for their being. It's by doing something to myself, I made there be two of them. But then Hume says the regular principle of reasoning from cause and effect is that for like effects, we expect like causes. So, so it's a violation of that to say one of them has a distinct existence from me and the other doesn't. Right. And so we should conclude that that neither of them does. And and that means that it even when there was only one, again, it had a like cause. It depended on me. So so it's certainly false that our impressions have a distinct existence. Therefore, it's false that they have a continued existence. Therefore, the vulgar view, although not absurd, is false. And I don't have time to say more about the philosophical view. Maybe I'll say more about it next time. I will see you then. Oh, and next time will be, and this time I hope this will actually happen. Next time will be Monday via Zoom. Okay, see you then. Bye.